So let's continue styling some buttons, this time the voting buttons on each of the facts. And the buttons I'm talking about are of course these ones here. Let's just give this a bit more space. Yeah, something like this. So the goal is for the buttons to look like this. So they have a little bit of a even lighter background color and these rounded corners and of course a hover effect. Also, they are all side by side nicely. So that's another important thing that we need to keep in mind. But first, let's style the visual aspect. And for that, we will go back to our colors here. So let's see first what we already have. So the fact has this background color. So that is here, this one. And so now the next one again is this one. So the next lighter color. So this is the one that we're going to use. But for now, we need to actually select each of the buttons. So let's see how we will do that. So the buttons are right here inside this div with the class of vote buttons. And so now I will not add a class to each of the buttons, but instead I will select the parent, so vote buttons, and then select all the child button elements. And if that sounds confusing, this is what we did here before with the image inside of the logo. Okay, so in this case, it makes sense because there are just so many buttons, and then I would have to add a class to all of them. And that would first be a bit of work, and second, might pollute the HTML a bit. So adding a lot more classes, at some point it becomes a bit more difficult to read. So vote buttons, buttons, and then all the buttons that are inside there. So all simply the button elements. Now I think this vote buttons is already somewhere. Let's find that, cut it from here. Yeah, here we go. So once the file starts to get bigger, we really need to organize the code a little bit, but let's maybe leave that for a bit later. And for now, let's start by adding that background color. So that was this one here, I think, that I said we would use. And so there is some color at least already, but now remember that we need to get rid of the border, or of the border actually. So border none, just like before. And yeah, so the color is definitely a bit lighter, but let's actually do it a bit more light. So let's choose this one. And so that should then work. Yeah, beautiful. Next up, we need to increase the font size. Let's say 18 pixels. And let's also give it some padding here. So 6 top bottom and 12 on the sides. So that's something I like to do, is to duplicate on the sides. All right, and now some border radius. And then we're finally ready to do some layout, I think. So border radius, and I will simply again use the 100 pixel trick, so something really big. And yeah, let's actually also change the color and even the font family, because remember, those two are not inherited by the buttons. So what we did before was to inherit the color, so to force inheritance. There we go. And we can do the same with the font family, because it also hasn't been inherited. So instead of manually setting it, we just inherit it, and now that's beautiful. Just one final thing is that the text is bold here, but I would say it is a bit too bold. And that boldness comes here from the strong. So we give it a strong here, but that might not make a lot of sense. So let's remove the strong here, because we used this in the HTML section, but this was mainly to show you that we could style something with HTML. But now we want to do it even a bit better in CSS. So what we're going to do is to give these buttons a font weight. So a font weight value. And if you remember way back from when we included the Google fonts, we included some different font weights there, remember? And we can see which font weights we selected right here. So this is the font family Sono, and then the weights we selected were 400, 600, and 700s. So these are basically different forms of boldness. And so those are the ones that are now available to us and that we can use. So font weight, and let's start with 700. And so that's exactly what we had before. So when we use strong in HTML, it basically sets the font weight to 700, which more or less we can say means simply bold. So we could actually say also bold here as a keyword, and that would look the same. However, in this case, the 600, which is like semi-bold, looks a bit nicer, I think. So let's keep that. And in fact, we can then delete the 700 from here so that we don't unnecessarily load it from the server. And by the way, the default weight is always this 400, and that's why we selected that. So we could, of course, go ahead and here set font weight also to 600, and then everything would get that. So it would be inherited, right? But the default, again, is 400, which is this. And so if it's the default, there's not even a need to write it down. Okay, just to finish, let's give our button here that hand. So cursor of pointer. Okay, and now it's time to lay it out. So in order to place them side by side. Here I have a typo. Okay, but now we are ready. So we want to put these side by side. So what better tool is there than Flexbox? So as always, we need to define what the flex items are and what the flex container should be. So the flex items, of course, are these buttons that need to be side by side. And so the flex container is their parent element. And so that is, of course, vote buttons. So display flex. And with this, they are already side by side. They are not ideal because the text is here not on the side of them, but we will fix that in a minute. For now, let's add some gap here. So gap 8 pixels, and there we go. So let's see what happens when we make this a bit bigger. So you see that at a certain point, it actually starts looking nice. However, we want basically these elements here to always look like this. We never want the text to be below. Now the problem is that this element, sometimes it's simply not wide enough. So this entire, and for some reason I think I closed the dev tools. Let's bring them back. Yeah. So here we have them back. And so as I was saying, sometimes this element is simply not big enough. And so then these numbers will simply jump and they will move down so that there is again enough space. Right? So the problem here has nothing to do with what we did with this flex layout for these buttons. So there we are done. Everything is perfect and there's nothing more we can do. The problem is that these themselves are also flex items. Remember that? So way back, we defined this entire fact, so this li element, as a flex container. And so this is a flex item, this is a flex item, and this is a flex item. But at the same time, it's also a flex container. So this is what happens when we nest Flexbox inside of Flexbox. It can become a little bit confusing, right? But for now, simply forget that this is also a flex container, okay? So just forget that we ever used Flexbox here on these buttons, because then it might be a little bit less confusing. So we now simply have the problem that sometimes this vote buttons element is not wide enough. So that happens because it shrinks down when there's not enough space. For example, when this text here is bigger than one line. So you see immediately when it moved to the second line, then there's not enough space anymore. And so yeah, this then moved down. So what can we do? Fortunately for us, we can fix it. And let's leave it like this. So what we can do here is, because this is a flex item, so a child of the flex container, we can do something here. So there's a few properties that we can define on the flex item. So we can define flex grow, flex shrink, and flex size, I believe. So I actually also rarely use these, but now it is important to use flex shrink. So we can set flex shrink, which by default is 1, to 0. And what this means is that we now no longer allow this element to shrink. So when we save it now, you see that now there's always enough space for this element here to be as big as it needs to be. So instead what happened now is that this text here got really small. So let me show that to you. So here we have the flex shrink, and when I turn it off, then this one grows a little bit more, and this one here gets again compressed. So here we basically disallow this flex item to shrink, okay? So this might be a little bit confusing, so just roll with it, I'd say. And yeah, if you want to, again, learn Flexbox a little bit deeper, there are many resources out there. Great. Okay. Well, now there's actually really not enough space here because we are not allowing it to shrink anymore. And here the text can also not shrink anymore. And so we get some overflowing issues here. But this is actually exactly what we will fix in the last lecture of the course. Not of the course, but of this section. So let's leave it like this for now. And yeah, just add these very simple hover animations. So just basically making it darker as we hover over it. So that should be very easy, even though the syntax now might look a little bit weird. So we select the buttons again. Remember, we chose to not select them with a class on their own, but simply as a child of vote buttons class. And now we add the hover here to the button. So background color, and now let's actually choose this darkest one. So basically this background color here. The final piece of the puzzle is to add the transition. Let's again use 0.3 seconds. And there it is. Beautiful, very beautiful. So keeping it subtle here. Of course, we could animate every single property that is here. Yeah, but sometimes less is really more. Just notice how we really place the hover here on the button, because this is really where we want to detect the hover. So we could also do this. So then this style here would apply whenever the hover happens here. So you see that? So all of this here is the vote buttons. And so we hover it, and then all the buttons in there get that color. So of course that's not what we want. So let's put it back, because we want this to happen when in fact the button itself get hovered. Great, very, very nice. We're getting very close to the end. Next up, we will just style these forms elements, because they still look a little bit, well, like with their default styling. So let's take a break, or maybe not, and then I'll meet you in the next lecture.